December 15th, 1943. The snow-covered mountains of northern Italy echoed with the grinding of steel tracks against frozen stone as a German armored column wound its way through the treacherous Alpine passes. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber adjusted his headset inside his Panzer IV tank, confident that nothing could stop their advance through this remote valley. The local resistance was scattered, poorly equipped, and consisted mainly of farmers and shopkeepers. What possible threat could they pose to 27 tons of German engineering excellence? Little did Weber know that 3 kilometers ahead, a 34-year-old widow named Maria Rossini was about to turn his certainties upside down, using nothing more than kitchen scraps and a mother's desperate ingenuity. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how one woman's seemingly absurd plan would transform a routine military advance into a logistical catastrophe, proving that in wartime, the most unlikely weapons often come from the most unexpected places. Maria Rossini stood at her kitchen window, watching the distant plume of exhaust smoke that marked the approaching German column. Her weathered hands gripped a wooden spoon so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. 6 months earlier, her husband Paolo had been taken by German forces during a sweep of suspected resistance sympathizers. Now she was alone with her 8-year-old daughter Lucia, trying to survive in a world that had forgotten mercy. The resistance cell in their mountain village of San Marco consisted of exactly 11 people, most over the age of 50. Their weapons inventory included 4 hunting rifles, 2 pistols from the previous war, and enough ammunition to last perhaps 10 minutes in a real firefight. Against an armored column, they might as well have been throwing stones at the moon. "Mama, are the bad men coming here?" Lucia asked from behind her, clutching a threadbare doll. Maria turned and knelt beside her daughter, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Not if I can help it, little star," she said, using Paolo's pet name for their daughter. But Maria knew the statistics as well as anyone. German Panzer IV tanks weighed 27 tons each and were armed with 75mm main guns capable of penetrating 4 inches of steel armor. Their maximum speed on roads reached 40 kilometers per hour, and their fuel capacity allowed for a range of 200 kilometers. The column approaching San Marco included at least 8 such vehicles, accompanied by support trucks and approximately 100 infantry soldiers. What the Germans didn't know was that Maria Rossini had spent the last 3 weeks collecting every drop of cooking grease, soap fat, and oil she could find. Not for food, there was precious little of that, but for something far more ambitious. 3 days earlier, Maria had approached Giuseppe Toretti, the nominal leader of their ragtag resistance cell, with what he initially dismissed as the ravings of a desperate woman. "Giuseppe," she had said, spreading a hand-drawn map across his kitchen table, "what if we could make their tanks slip off the mountain?" Toretti had laughed, his weathered face creasing into familiar lines of skepticism. "Maria, those machines weigh more than a dozen oxen. You can't just push them over." "I'm not talking about pushing," Maria replied, her voice carrying the quiet intensity that made people listen despite themselves. "I'm talking about making them slide." She pointed to a section of the mountain road known locally as the Devil's Elbow, a sharp switchback turn where the path curved around a granite outcropping with a 200-meter drop into the valley below. The road there was barely wide enough for a single tank, with no guardrail and only loose gravel for traction. "The road surface is already treacherous," Maria explained, "but what if we made it impossible to grip? What if we covered that entire section with something so slippery that even those massive tracks couldn't find purchase?" Toretti had studied the map in silence for several minutes. "What did you have in mind?" Maria smiled for the first time in months. "Cooking grease, lots of it." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Over the following days, Maria and 5 other women from the village collected every scrap of fat they could find. Old cooking grease saved from better times, soap rendered from animal fat, oil pressed from olives, even the waxy residue from candles. Everything was gathered and combined into a slippery, viscous mixture that could turn solid stone into a skating rink. But collecting the materials was only half the challenge. They needed to apply their improvised lubricant at exactly the right moment and in precisely the right location. Too early, and the mountain wind would blow it away, or the substance would freeze solid. Too late, and the lead tanks would already be past the danger zone. Angelo Benedetti, a former railroad worker who knew the mountain roads better than anyone, provided crucial intelligence. "The column is moving slowly," he reported, after watching their approach through binoculars. "Maybe 15 kilometers per hour up the steeper sections. The lead tank has to reduce speed even further on the tight turns, maybe 8 or 10 kilometers per hour. This gave them a narrow window of opportunity. The entire operation would need to be completed in the space of perhaps 90 seconds between the time the lead tank rounded the bend before the Devil's Elbow and when it reached the critical section of road. Maria's plan called for precise timing and iron nerves. 6 women would position themselves at different points along the mountainside, each carrying containers of their improvised lubricant mixture. When the signal came, a specific whistle pattern from Angelo's lookout position, they would emerge from hiding and dump their contents across the road surface, creating a slippery trap that would extend for approximately 50 meters. On the morning of December 15th, as the German column began its ascent towards San Marco, Maria took her position behind a cluster of pine trees just 20 meters from the Devil's Elbow. The container beside her held nearly 15 liters of the grease mixture, painstakingly collected over 3 weeks. It had the consistency of thick honey and smelled like a combination of kitchen scraps and industrial lubricant. "Remember," she whispered to Francesca Morelli, the baker's widow positioned 30 meters away, "wait for Angelo's signal, then move fast. We'll have maybe 30 seconds before the tank reaches the slippery section." Through the trees, Maria could hear the approaching rumble of diesel engines and steel tracks grinding against stone. The sound grew louder with each passing minute, accompanied by the occasional shout of German commands echoing off the mountainside. At 0945 hours, Obergefreiter Weber's tank rounded the final bend before the Devil's Elbow. Weber peered through his periscope at the narrow road ahead, noting the sharp turn and steep drop-off. "Reduce speed to 10 kilometers per hour, he commanded his driver. "This section looks treacherous." Panzer driver Unteroffizier Fritz Schulman acknowledged the order and shifted into a lower gear. The 27-ton machine slowed to a crawl as it approached the switchback, its wide tracks seeking purchase on the rocky surface. That was when Angelo's whistle echoed across the mountainside, 3 short blasts followed by 2 long ones. Maria emerged from behind her tree cover and ran toward the road, her heavy container of grease mixture sloshing with each step. Around her, 5 other women appeared simultaneously, moving with practiced efficiency despite their limited rehearsal time. They had perhaps 20 seconds before Weber's tank rounded the elbow and entered the trap zone. Maria reached the road first and began pouring her mixture in a wide arc across the stone surface. The grease spread quickly, creating a slick film that reflected the winter sunlight like a mirror. Francesca arrived seconds later, adding her contribution to the growing slippery patch. "More toward the outer edge," Maria called, directing her team to concentrate their efforts where the tank tracks would naturally travel. "We need complete coverage." By the time Weber's Panzer IV came around the Devil's Elbow, the road surface had been transformed into something resembling an ice skating rink. The first indication of trouble came when Schulman attempted to negotiate the turn at his usual careful pace. "Something's wrong," Schulman reported over the intercom as he felt the tank's massive weight beginning to shift in an unexpected direction. "The tracks aren't gripping properly." Weber grabbed his periscope and scanned the road ahead. The surface appeared normal, but he could see an unusual sheen reflecting the morning light. "What is that on the road?" he muttered. Before Schulman could respond, the tank's left track hit the slickest section of Maria's improvised trap. 27 tons of German armor suddenly began sliding sideways toward the cliff edge like a child's toy on a polished floor. "Emergency brake!" Weber shouted, but the command was useless. Braking only locked the tracks in place, turning the tank into an unguided missile sliding inexorably toward the precipice. From her hiding place, Maria watched in amazement as her seemingly ridiculous plan unfolded exactly as she had hoped. The massive tank, which had seemed so unstoppable just minutes earlier, was now helpless against the simple physics of friction, or rather, the complete absence of it. Schulman frantically attempted to steer away from the cliff edge, but the grease mixture had eliminated any possibility of directional control. The tank continued its sideways slide, its track spinning uselessly against the lubricated stone surface. "Abandon vehicle!" Weber commanded as he realized their situation was hopeless. The tank crew had perhaps 10 seconds to escape before their 27-ton machine would slide over the edge and tumble 200 meters into the valley below. Weber popped his turret hatch and hauled himself out, followed quickly by his gunner and loader. Schulman emerged last, just as the tank's left track cleared the road surface entirely. The Panzer IV balanced on the edge for what seemed like an eternity, maybe 3 seconds in reality. Before gravity claimed its inevitable victory, the massive machine tipped past its center of balance and began its fatal tumble into the abyss below. The sound of 27 tons of steel armor crashing down a rocky mountainside echoed through the valley like thunder. When the reverberations finally faded, Weber and his crew found themselves standing on a grease-slicked road, staring at the empty space where their tank had been just moments before. The second tank in the column, commanded by Obergefreiter Heinrich Müller, had witnessed the entire incident from 50 meters behind. Müller immediately ordered his driver to halt and radioed a warning to the rest of the column. "Lead vehicle has been lost," he reported with professional calm that masked his inner shock. "Unknown obstacle on the road surface. Request immediate reconnaissance of the area." But Maria and her team were far from finished. As the German infantry began to deploy for a careful advance toward the Devil's Elbow, the resistance women retreated to their secondary positions. They had prepared enough grease mixture to treat a second section of road, a straight stretch where the remaining tanks would be forced to travel single file between 2 large boulders. Capitano Roberto Santini, the senior German officer present, found himself facing an unprecedented tactical situation. His column had just lost a 27-ton tank to what appeared to be a road surface treatment of unknown composition. Traditional military doctrine offered no guidance for dealing with improvised lubricant attacks. "What exactly are we facing here?" Santini asked his reconnaissance team after they had carefully examined the affected road section. "It appears to be some kind of grease or oil, sir," reported Unteroffizier Hans Zimmermann. "The entire road surface has been coated with a substance that eliminates traction completely. It's like trying to drive on ice, but worse." Santini studied the terrain ahead through his binoculars. The road offered no alternate routes, sheer cliff walls on one side, deadly drop-offs on the other. His column would have to proceed through several more sections where similar attacks could be mounted. "How long would it take to clean the road surface?" he inquired. "With proper equipment, perhaps 2 hours per affected section, sir," Zimmermann replied. "But we have no chemical solvents available, and the substance appears to be quite persistent." Meanwhile, from her new position overlooking the boulder passage, Maria watched as the German column reorganized itself. She could see Santini conferring with his officers, obviously trying to determine how to proceed safely through terrain that had suddenly become far more dangerous than any minefield. "They're moving forward again," whispered Francesca from her hiding spot behind a fallen log. "Should we use the rest of our mixture?" Maria considered their options. They had enough grease to treat perhaps 50 meters of road surface, enough to trap 1 or 2 more tanks if they positioned it correctly. But they also needed to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. "Wait," she decided. "Let's see what they do." Santini's solution was methodical but time-consuming. He ordered his infantry to advance on foot, carefully testing each section of road before allowing the tanks to proceed. Soldiers armed with long poles probed the surface ahead, looking for signs of the slippery substance that had claimed their lead vehicle. This process reduced the column's advance to a crawling pace, perhaps 2 kilometers per hour instead of their normal 15 to 20. What should have been a routine 1-hour transit through the mountain pass was now stretching into an all-day ordeal. As the morning wore on, Maria realized that her improvised attack had achieved something far more valuable than the destruction of a single tank. It had introduced an element of uncertainty and fear that would affect German operations throughout the region. Every narrow mountain road would now be viewed with suspicion. Every turn would require careful reconnaissance. The psychological impact was already evident in the behavior of Santini's remaining tank crews. Where they had previously moved with confident efficiency, they now proceeded with nervous caution. Tank commanders kept their hatches open, ready to abandon their vehicles at the first sign of trouble. Drivers reduced their speeds far below tactical requirements, afraid that the next turn might send them tumbling into an abyss. By noon, the German column had advanced only 4 kilometers from the site of the first tank loss, a distance they could have covered in 15 minutes under normal circumstances. Santini found himself facing an impossible choice: continue the slow, dangerous advance through terrain, where any turn could hide another trap, or abandon the mission entirely and retreat. The decision was made for him when Angelo's next signal echoed across the mountainside. As the second tank approached the boulder passage, Maria's team once again emerged from concealment and deployed their remaining grease mixture across the narrow road surface. This time, however, Obergefreiter Müller was ready. Having witnessed the fate of Weber's tank, he had his driver halt immediately upon seeing the suspicious activity ahead. "Infantry forward," Müller commanded. "I want that road section cleared before we proceed." The German soldiers advanced cautiously, but they were too late to prevent the grease application and too early to clear it effectively without proper equipment. The road surface between the two boulders was now as treacherous as the Devil's Elbow had been hours earlier. Santini surveyed the situation from his command position and made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 12 hours earlier. "We're turning around," he announced over the radio. "Mission aborted due to impassable terrain." The retreat began immediately, with the remaining tanks carefully backing down the mountain road they had climbed with such confidence that morning. It was a humiliating withdrawal, forced by nothing more sophisticated than kitchen grease and the determination of a handful of mountain villagers. Maria watched the German column disappear around the lower bends of the mountain road and felt a mixture of exhaustion and amazement. Her ridiculous plan had actually worked. 8 German tanks and 100 infantry soldiers had been turned back by 6 women armed with cooking scraps and intimate knowledge of their home terrain. But the true measure of her success would only become apparent in the following weeks. Word of the grease attack spread throughout the resistance network across northern Italy, inspiring similar improvised operations in dozens of other mountain communities. German columns found themselves facing slippery roads, soap-coated bridge surfaces, and oil-treated tunnel floors, wherever local resistance fighters had the materials and determination to implement Maria's technique. The German command was forced to divert significant resources to deal with what they classified as terrain denial operations. Special cleaning crews had to be organized and equipped with chemical solvents. Reconnaissance teams were assigned to test road surfaces before tank columns could advance. Alternate routes had to be surveyed and prepared for areas where the primary roads had been compromised. Most importantly, the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical inconvenience. German tank crews throughout the region became hesitant and overcautious, reducing their operational effectiveness even in areas where no grease attacks had occurred. The fear of sliding off a cliff had become as potent a weapon as any explosive device. 3 weeks after the incident at Devil's Elbow, Maria received an unexpected visitor. Capitano Alessandro Ferretti of the Italian Resistance Command had traveled from Turin specifically to meet the woman who had figured out how to make German tanks slip like soap in a bathtub. "We want to coordinate similar operations throughout the region," Ferretti explained over a carefully prepared dinner of ersatz coffee and black bread. "Your technique could be replicated anywhere there are mountain roads and kitchen scraps." Maria listened to his plans with growing amazement. What had begun as a desperate mother's attempt to protect her village was now being discussed as a component of regional military strategy. "But it was just cooking grease," she protested. "Nothing sophisticated about it." "That's exactly what makes it so effective," Ferretti replied. "The Germans have countermeasures for explosives, ambushes, and sabotage operations, but they never considered that someone would use kitchen waste to disable their armor." Over the following months, the Rossini technique, as it became known in resistance circles, was employed in over 40 documented operations across northern Italy. German casualties from these incidents were typically minimal. Most tank crews managed to escape before their vehicles went over cliffs, but the operational disruption was enormous. Entire German divisions found their movement schedules disrupted by the need to carefully clean and inspect every mountain road before use. Supply convoys that had once moved freely through the Alps now required elaborate security preparations that consumed time and personnel desperately needed elsewhere. The technique also proved remarkably difficult to counter using conventional military methods. Unlike explosive devices, grease could be applied quickly by untrained personnel using materials available in any village. Unlike ambushes, the attacks required no weapons and left no evidence that could be traced back to specific individuals. Unlike sabotage operations, they could be implemented by people with no military training whatsoever. By the spring of 1944, German operational reports from northern Italy regularly included warnings about road surface contamination and requirements for traction testing that would have seemed absurd to military planners just months earlier. Tanks that had been designed to cross rivers and climb steep terrain were being defeated by a mixture of bacon grease and soap fat. The personal cost to Maria was significant but bearable. German forces eventually identified her as a resistance operative, forcing her to relocate to a safe house in the mountains with Lucia. They lived in hiding for the remainder of the conflict, supported by a resistance network that had come to regard Maria as something of a folk hero. "Did I really help win the fight against the bad men, Mama?" Lucia asked one evening, as they sat by a small fire in their mountain refuge. Maria pulled her daughter close and considered the question carefully. "We helped, little star," she replied. "Sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences." When the conflict in Italy finally ended in 1945, Maria was able to return to San Marco and rebuild her life. The village had survived relatively intact, partly because German forces had largely avoided the area after the incidents at Devil's Elbow. The road there still showed faint stains where her grease mixture had been applied, marks that would persist for years as a reminder of the day ordinary kitchen scraps had defeated modern military technology. Maria never saw herself as a hero or a military strategist. She was simply a mother who had refused to accept that overwhelming force was automatically decisive. Her legacy lived on not just in the tactical manuals that would later document improvised resistance techniques, but in the fundamental understanding that creativity and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable advantages. The tanks she had sent tumbling into the valley represented hundreds of tons of steel, sophisticated engineering, and industrial capability that Germany could hardly afford to lose. But more than that, they represented a psychological victory that proved even the most imposing military forces could be vulnerable to the simplest forms of resistance. Years later, military historians would study the grease attacks of northern Italy as examples of asymmetric warfare that anticipated techniques used in conflicts around the world. But Maria herself preferred to remember them simply as proof that a mother's love and ingenuity could be more powerful than any weapon ever forged. The sound of her cooking grease sending 27 tons of German armor tumbling into the abyss had echoed through those mountain valleys for only a few seconds. But the message it carried, that ordinary people armed with determination and creativity could resist even the most overwhelming force, continued to resonate long after the last echoes had faded into silence. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.